Right now, foods are disappearing from shelves in a way that doesn't look like anything you've been trained to recognize. There's no news alert, no footage of crowds pushing carts, no moment where you look up and realize something is wrong. It's a paper tag where a product used to be. It's a section that's half full when it was full the last 3 visits. It's a large format container that quietly vanished while the small version stayed on the shelf right next to the empty space. That last one is the signal most people miss. And it's the one I want you to remember. Here's the pattern I've documented tracking stores over the past several months. When a supply disruption is building, it almost always hits large containers first. Bulk bags, gallon jugs, commercial scale boxes. The smaller retail versions stick around longer because they're higher margin, easier to move, and lower on the priority cut list. By the time the small version disappears, the disruption has been building for months. The small format disappearance is the last warning, not the first. The people who act on the large format signal, and they exist, they're in every store, they just don't announce themselves. Today I'm going to show you 11 specific foods experiencing this exact pattern right now. For each one, I'll tell you why it's disappearing, what most people get wrong about storing it, and exactly what to do about it. I'll also show you what all 11 items cost to acquire together, and the number is going to be lower than you expect. You probably have 2 or 3 of these on your regular shopping list already, and don't realize they're at risk. That's exactly where we're starting. If you find this useful, hit subscribe now, because I track actual store inventory across multiple locations every week. When something changes, I'll have the video up before most people notice the gap. Let's go. Item 1, canned butter, the ghost product. About 4 months ago, I was standing in a farm supply store that carries specialty shelf-stable foods, and I watched a man, calm, no urgency in his body language at all, work his way down a section of canned butter and put every single unit in his cart. Every one. The shelf was full when he arrived. By the time he reached the end, he'd spent maybe 4 minutes and the shelf was empty. He didn't rush. He didn't look around to see if anyone was watching. He just worked down the row like he was doing a routine errand. That's when I started paying serious attention to this product. Canned butter is real dairy butter, not a substitute, not a flavored oil, sealed in a can and shelf-stable for years without refrigeration. In the United States right now, there are only 3 significant brands producing genuine canned butter. 3. And 2 of them are currently facing serious production disruptions. One facility dealt with a fire earlier this year. Another is facing a shortage not of the butter itself, but of the aluminum cans used to package it, because can manufacturing is its own supply chain with its own pressures. Rising demand is running directly into shrinking supply from both directions at once. Now here's something that applies to this item and to several others we'll cover today, so pay attention to this pattern. I'm calling it the label deception, and once you see it, you'll never read a shelf life date the same way again. The printed date on a can of canned butter typically shows 2 to 3 years. That number is not food science. It's a legal liability threshold, the point at which the manufacturer will no longer stand behind the product in court. The actual storage science on properly sealed canned butter, kept at consistent temperatures between 60 and 70 degrees Fahrenheit, consistently points to 5 to 10 years of viable quality. The gap between the label date and the real food science date is 4 to 6 times. That gap exists because the liability lawyers, not the food scientist, wrote the number on the can. What that means practically: a single can, which holds the equivalent of about 3 sticks of butter, stored correctly in a basement or interior closet, gives you close to a decade of real butter in a space smaller than a soup can. Not margarine, not a spread. Real butter. When I first found this product, it was running around $8 a can. The same cans are currently $14 when you can find them at all. Multiple suppliers are showing out of stock with no restock date. If you find them in stock right now, the price you're looking at today is likely the lowest you'll see for a while. Store between 60 and 70 degrees. Avoid garages and sheds. Temperature cycling degrades the product even through a sealed can. A basement or interior closet, away from any heat source, is ideal. The window here is genuinely narrowing. That's not a prediction. That's the current inventory picture. Stay with me. The next item addresses a nutritional gap that most people building a food reserve don't know they have, and I'll show you specifically what I mean. Item 2. Evaporated milk and pull-tab cans. The invisible dairy. I want to start with the pull-tab part specifically, because it matters more than it might seem. In any situation that disrupts your normal routine, a multi-day power outage, an evacuation, anything that breaks the flow of a regular kitchen, a can that opens without a separate tool, is in a categorically different class of useful compared to one that requires a can opener. This sounds obvious right up until you're the person who packed 3 days of canned food and left the can opener sitting on your kitchen counter. I've talked to people who've done exactly this. At that point, the distinction stops being minor and becomes the only thing that matters. But beyond the practical opening advantage, evaporated milk is one of the most underrated shelf-stable foods you can store, and here's where almost everyone gets it completely backwards. Most people think of evaporated milk as a lesser substitute for fresh milk, a downgrade you use when you can't get the real thing. It's the opposite. Evaporated milk is real dairy, with roughly 60% of the water removed. What remains is a more concentrated form of every nutrient the original milk contained. 1 cup delivers approximately 16 grams of protein compared to 8 grams in a cup of fresh whole milk. You're getting more calcium, more fat-soluble vitamins, and more nutritional density per cup than fresh milk provides. You're not substituting down. You are nutritionally substituting up. I spent 2 weeks using evaporated milk in place of fresh milk in everything my family ate: coffee, cereal, mashed potatoes, pasta sauce, baked goods. I told them after the fact. Nobody noticed during. The mashed potatoes were better, richer, more satisfying. The coffee was stronger and more filling. My family's verdict when I finally told them what they'd been drinking: mild annoyance that I'd run an experiment without permission, and genuine interest in keeping it in the rotation. The supply concern here comes from a distribution-level reality in the dairy industry. Shelf-stable dairy products get deprioritized when production capacity gets tight. Fresh milk and aged cheese carry higher margins, so they get the available facility resources first. That reprioritization is already visible in retail inventory at multiple major chains. The small format cans are holding. The pull-tab versions are getting genuinely harder to find. Start looking this week, specifically for the pull-tab cans. I mentioned earlier I'd show you something at item 7 that changes how most people think about crisis nutrition entirely. That's coming. Keep watching. Item 3. Canned tomato paste, the morale multiplier. 3 weeks ago, I made a specific trip to a major grocery chain for one item: canned tomato paste. Small cans. Standard product. I've bought it in the same aisle at the same store, dozens of times. The shelf was completely bare. Not low stock. Not one size missing. Empty metal shelf with a paper tag where the product should have been. I went to 2 other locations that day. Same story at both. Out of stock. All 3 stores. Same day. I found a stock clerk who'd been at one of those stores for over a decade. He told me tomato paste had been on backorder from their primary supplier for 6 weeks. Partial shipments sell out within hours of hitting the floor. Corporate had told staff not to expect normal stock levels for months. Here's what's driving it. California produces roughly 95% of all processed tomatoes in the United States. Nearly all of it from one state. And that state has been hit from multiple directions simultaneously. Water use restrictions limiting planting acreage, labor cost pressures affecting harvesting and processing operations, and rising aluminum and steel costs, making the small low-margin cans the first product that food companies deprioritize when they need to cut something. Tomato paste in a 6-ounce can is low margin. It gets cut first. Now here's what most people get wrong about why this matters. They think tomato paste is optional. A flavor add-on. Something nice to have. I spent 30 days eating exclusively from my own stored food. By day 10, everything tasted exactly the same. Rice was rice. Beans were beans. Canned vegetables were something you ate because you had to, not because you wanted to. Then I started using tomato paste, and within 2 meals, something shifted. Rice with spices and a spoonful of tomato paste became an actual meal. Beans became chili. Canned vegetables became soup. The psychological difference was not subtle. It was the difference between feeding yourself and eating. But here's the nutritional angle that almost nobody in this space talks about. A single 6-ounce can of tomato paste contains more bioavailable lycopene than 10 raw tomatoes. Lycopene is a fat-soluble antioxidant with documented roles in immune function and cellular health. In a prolonged situation where you're not eating fresh produce, That specific nutrient matters in a way that goes beyond flavor. This is not just a morale item. It is a dense, affordable nutrient source in a format that lasts 2 to 3 years on a shelf and costs almost nothing per can. Here's all I want you to do with this one. Next shopping trip, buy 6 extra cans. 6. That's probably $3. That's the prep. Something happened on day 14 of my 30-day experiment that I want to come back to because it connects everything on this list together. I'll show you the full picture at the end. First, let's talk about the item that reveals the most dangerous false sense of security in food storage. Item 4. Bulk yeast, the hardest thing to store correctly. Last month, I was tracking inventory across 8 grocery stores in my area simultaneously. 4 of those 8 stores were completely out of yeast at the same time. Not low stock. Not one variety unavailable. Completely out. Multiple varieties. For over a week. When I asked store managers what was happening, the answer was consistent across multiple locations. Suppliers are not delivering on schedule, and there's no reliable timeline for when that normalizes. One procurement manager at a regional chain described yeast as one of their current red list products, items they are actively concerned about keeping consistently in stock. That's the language people who move product for a living use when they're genuinely worried. The underlying cause is straightforward once you understand the production math. Home baking demand surged dramatically in 2020. Yeast manufacturers scaled up production capacity to meet that peak. When the peak passed, capacity scaled back down. But a significant portion of that new home baking habit stayed. Baseline demand is measurably higher than it was in 2019, while production capacity has largely returned to pre-surge levels. The math doesn't balance. It's not a temporary blip, it's a structural mismatch that hasn't been corrected. Now here's the part that most people who think they've already solved this problem don't want to hear. Standard yeast packets stored in a pantry last approximately 6 months before viability begins dropping. In a refrigerator, you might get a year. In a freezer, close to 2 years, but viability starts declining before you hit that mark, and a packet that's been in the freezer too long may not activate properly when you actually need it. The preparation most people have made with standard packets is not as secure as they believe. They have yeast. They don't have reliable yeast. The actual solution that experienced long-term preppers use is vacuum-sealed yeast bricks. 1-pound blocks sealed and frozen that maintain viability for 5 years or more with minimal quality loss. You break off what you need, allow it to come to room temperature, and it activates normally. I've had 4 of these stored for over a year. I test a small amount every 90 days, just a teaspoon in warm water with a pinch of sugar, watching for foam within 10 minutes. Every single test has been successful. Each brick costs around $6 and contains the equivalent of more than 60 individual 3-packs of standard yeast. Do that math and you're looking at significant cost savings alongside dramatically extended shelf life. The two go together. There's also a zero infrastructure backup worth building in parallel, a sourdough starter. Wild yeast that you cultivate and maintain with nothing but flour and water, kept alive indefinitely. It requires more daily attention than commercial yeast and produces a different result, but once it's established and healthy, you have a functionally unlimited yeast supply as long as you have flour and water. That's a meaningful piece of resilience that costs almost nothing to create and nothing to sustain. What comes next isn't a staple food. Most people think of it as a luxury item, right up until they're 2 weeks into eating from cans. At that point, they understand on a visceral level why every experienced prepper I've talked to keeps it without exception. Item 5. Shelf-stable bacon, the psychological anchor. About 18 months ago, I found this in a camping supply store and assumed it was a novelty. Fully cooked bacon in a vacuum-sealed foil pouch. No refrigeration. 18 months shelf life. I bought one pouch as an experiment, skeptical, fully expecting to throw it out. I opened it, dropped it in a dry pan for about 30 seconds, and ate it standing at the stove. It tasted like bacon. Not restaurant bacon. Not Sunday morning from a cast iron pan. But real, recognizable, satisfying bacon. I went back that same week and bought 20 pouches. Here's why this matters at a level that goes well beyond flavor. Protein in a crisis situation is scarce and usually unpleasant. Canned chicken is tolerable. Canned tuna works. Most other shelf-stable meats are something you eat because you're hungry, not because you want to. Shelf-stable bacon operates in a different category entirely, and not just because it tastes better. There's a documented body of research from disaster relief operations, FEMA field assessments, Red Cross post-deployment reports that consistently identifies what relief workers call morale foods. These are specific items that trigger sensory memory of normal life, particular smells, textures, RS that the nervous system associates with safety, comfort, and routine. Those sensory triggers have a measurable effect on psychological stability during prolonged stress or displacement. Shelf-stable bacon, when you heat it in a pan, fills a space with the smell of a functioning kitchen. That's not a minor thing. That's your family's stress response receiving a signal that says things are okay, and under elevated stress, that signal matters in ways that are difficult to fully articulate. I know this from experience. During a winter power outage that ran 3 days, my household was eating cold food from cans. When the power came back, the first thing I heated was a packet of this bacon. The shift in the room was immediate. Not because anyone was starving. Because the smell said normal. Multiple brands that were reliably in stock 6 months ago are now either back-ordered or quietly discontinued. When I last checked the retail landscape, I could find this product from exactly one online source. 3 months before that, I had more than a dozen options. That contraction happened fast and without announcement. Before I give you the next item, I want to stop here for a moment, because what comes next is not just another food. It's the introduction to something I call the nutritional collapse sequence. And understanding this sequence is the thing that separates a real food reserve from a calorie stockpile that will make you sick over time. A standard prepper stockpile is good at calories and carbohydrates. Rice, beans, grains, it handles those well. What it does not handle is sodium and electrolytes, dietary fat and omega-3 fatty acids. Those 3 gaps, left unfilled, produce a specific predictable sequence of physical and cognitive problems. The next 3 items on this list close each of those gaps specifically. Pay attention to how they connect to each other. Item 6, bulk bouillon, the electrolyte infrastructure. Most people buy bouillon in the small grocery store boxes, 12 cubes, maybe 24. That's fine for everyday cooking. It doesn't serve you if you're building a real food reserve. The product I'm talking about is commercial-scale containers, 200 cubes or more. These were consistently available at warehouse stores until recently. Now they're intermittently out of stock. The small boxes remain easy to find. The large containers are not. And as I told you at the beginning of this video, when the large format disappears before the small format, that's the signal. Let me show you the math first, because it's one of the most compelling value calculations in this entire list. A single bouillon cube makes 1 cup of broth for approximately 5 cents. A can of store-bought broth runs around $2. When you're thinking about storing several hundred servings of liquid and flavor, those numbers matter enormously. 200 cubes fit in a container the size of a large shoebox. The equivalent volume in canned broth would occupy a significant portion of a closet shelf. I ran a blind taste test in my own kitchen. Rice cooked 3 ways: plain water, salted water, and bouillon broth. My family rated them without knowing which was which. Bouillon won by a margin that wasn't close. My kids said unprompted that they could eat it every single day. I currently store 800 cubes, 400 chicken, 400 beef, at a total cost of around $60. 800 servings of electrolyte-rich broth in a space that fits under a shelf. But here's the part that fundamentally changes how you think about this item. When you're eating exclusively from a standard stockpile, rice, beans, grains, canned vegetables, the first nutritional crisis that arrives is not protein deficiency. It's not vitamin depletion. It's sodium and electrolyte deficiency. Especially if you're doing any significant physical activity. Standard whole foods contain far less sodium than most people are accustomed to eating. And in a crisis situation, physical output typically increases. Hauling water, manual labor, disrupted sleep patterns, while sodium intake from food drops dramatically. The result is a specific and debilitating sequence. Fatigue sets in first, then muscle cramping, then cognitive fog, then impaired decision-making. This isn't theoretical. It's the documented clinical presentation of electrolyte depletion. Bouillon solves the sodium and electrolyte gap directly. It is not a flavor enhancer, dressed up as something important. It is electrolyte delivery infrastructure, in a cube. That is a completely different way of framing it, and it changes how essential this item actually is. Now, the next item is the one I told you about at the very start. the single nutritional category that experienced long-term preppers consistently rank above almost everything else on their priority list. And I'll be honest with you about what it took me to get past my own resistance to it. Item 7. Canned sardines and mackerel, the brain food. At the beginning of this video, I told you I'd show you the one nutritional category that separates a serious long-term food reserve from everything else. This is it. Sardines and mackerel. I know exactly what your face is doing right now. I avoided sardines for most of my adult life, based entirely on reputation, the smell, the texture, the association with extremely unglamorous eating. Then I actually analyzed the nutritional profile of every shelf-stable protein source available, and sardines kept appearing at the top of every serious breakdown. So I committed to a month, 2 cans a week, no skipping, honest assessment of what I was actually experiencing. The first can was genuinely rough. The smell hit differently than I expected. The texture required real adjustment. I ate it and moved on. By the third can, something had shifted. By the end of the first month, I was choosing sardines when I didn't have to. And I noticed something else. My focus felt cleaner across the day. My afternoon energy drop was less pronounced. I'm not making a clinical claim here, but I was eating sardines twice a week for 30 days, and the subjective experience tracked with what the nutritional science says should happen. Here's why that matters specifically in a crisis context. Omega-3 fatty acid deficiency has a documented and specific timeline of effect. Within 3 to 6 weeks of significantly reduced omega-3 intake, measurable changes begin appearing in mood stability, cognitive processing speed. In a prolonged high-stress situation, where you are making high-stakes decisions, managing family dynamics, operating on disrupted sleep, and running elevated cortisol continuously, chemically compromised decision-making, an omega-3 deficiency on that timeline directly contributes to it. This isn't a longevity concern. This is an acute performance concern. A single can of sardines delivers more omega-3 fatty acids than most fish oil supplements on the market, plus substantial protein, plus fat-soluble vitamins A and D, in a format with a 3 to 5 year shelf life that requires zero preparation. Open the can, eat, done. The supply concern here is structural and worsening. Global sardine and mackerel fisheries are under pressure from both overfishing and shifting ocean temperature conditions. Multiple major fisheries have reduced their annual catch quotas in recent years. The price reflects it. Quality sardines that cost around $2 a can 3 years ago are now running $4 or more. And availability at retail has become inconsistent in a way I didn't see 2 years ago. I keep 60 cans of sardines and 40 cans of mackerel in my rotation. I specifically buy the versions packed in olive oil, because the oil in the can contributes additional calories and nutritional value beyond the fish itself. None of this is optional in my storage system. This is my brain's primary long-term fuel source. I treat it accordingly. Next item, the one with a documented history as a currency during economic collapse, and a mathematical argument for buying it in bulk that most people have never seen calculated out loud. Item 8. Bulk sugar, the invisible currency. Most people walking through a grocery store right now see sugar on the shelves in 5-pound bags and conclude there's no supply problem. They're right, for the 5-pound bags. The 25 and 50-pound bulk bags are a different story. Purchase limits are appearing in some locations when the large format is available at all. The pattern we discussed at the opening, large format disappearing before small format, is active right now with sugar. Before I talk about why to store it, I want to show you a calculation I call the invisible inflation tax. And I want to do this with actual numbers. If you buy sugar in 5-pound bags at approximately $4.50 each, and you accumulate 50 pounds over a year through regular shopping, which is exactly what the majority of households do, you spend roughly $45 to get there. A 50-pound bulk bag today costs approximately $28 to $32 at most warehouse stores. That's a difference of $13 to $17 on a single 50-pound purchase. And here's where the invisible part comes in. That gap doesn't stay fixed. Prices have been rising consistently for 2 years. Every month you wait to buy in bulk, the premium you pay for procrastinating increases. You're not just paying more for convenience. You are paying a continuously compounding penalty for delay. The people who've been buying bulk for the past 2 years have been, in effect, locking in yesterday's prices today. That is the actual financial logic of proactive purchasing, not hoarding, not panic, just buying forward on things you know you will use. Now, why does sugar matter beyond the obvious? As a preservative, it's what makes jam, jellies, and preserved fruits possible at room temperature for years. Without it, long-term fruit preservation without refrigeration is nearly impossible. As a calorie source, 1 tablespoon delivers approximately 50 calories of immediate energy, significant when you're doing physical labor with limited food variety. And as a barter or trade commodity, sugar has a historical track record worth taking seriously. During Argentina's economic collapse in the early 2000s, first-person accounts from people who lived through it describe sugar trading at values comparable to small jewelry and medication. That is not a hypothetical. That is documented human behavior under economic stress, and it reflects something consistent across crisis economies. Basic culinary commodities become critical, very fast. Properly stored sugar in the original bag, inside a food-grade bucket with a sealed lid to block moisture infiltration. It doesn't spoil. It may clump if moisture gets in, but it remains fully usable. I currently store 150 pounds across 3 sealed buckets. Beyond white granulated, I keep brown sugar and powdered sugar separately. Each serves distinct culinary purposes that the others cannot replicate. The next item has seen the single most dramatic price increase of anything on this list. More than 100% in 2 years. And the reason is a conflict most people stopped paying daily attention to a long time ago. Item 9. Cooking oil in large farrup, the non-negotiable nutrient. 2 years ago, a gallon jug of standard vegetable or canola oil. Last month, I paid $13 for the same product at the same store. That is more than a 100% price increase in 24 months. And it's not just price. The actual availability of large format containers, gallon jugs and larger, has become genuinely inconsistent. I've made specific trips to stores for gallon jugs of oil and come home without them. Multiple times in the past several months. The drivers are real and connected to each other. Ukraine was one of the world's largest exporters of sunflower oil before the conflict disrupted both production and export logistics. Palm oil production has faced regulatory restrictions in multiple producing countries related to deforestation concerns. Soybean oil prices have risen alongside grain commodity prices broadly. These pressures are not resolving on a short timeline. But here's what most people don't fully understand about why this is non-negotiable. Dietary fat is not optional. Your body cannot function without adequate fat intake. That's not a dietary philosophy, it's physiology. The standard shelf-stable food stockpile, rice, beans, canned vegetables, grains, is extremely low in fat. A diet built around those staples without a dedicated fat source produces a predictable sequence of health problems that most people don't anticipate until they're already in it. Within 2 to 4 weeks of severely reduced dietary fat intake, hormonal disruption begins, specifically affecting cortisol production and sex hormone balance. Your cortisol system is your primary physiological stress response mechanism. In a crisis situation, it is running at elevated baseline continuously. A compromised cortisol system means a compromised capacity to manage stress, regulate emotion, and make decisions clearly. That is the last biological system you want undermined at precisely the moment you need it functioning at its highest. A single tablespoon of oil delivers approximately 120 calories of pure fat. Adding 3 to 4 tablespoons daily to rice and beans transforms those foods from something that fills your stomach to something that actually sustains your energy across a day. That distinction sounds small. Over several weeks of elevated physical output, it's the difference between functioning and deteriorating. My system is simple. I keep 12 gallons stored at all times in my basement, where the temperature is stable. Every 2 months, I pull the oldest container and use it in regular cooking, frying, sautéing, baking, and immediately replace it. I always have close to a year's worth available, and it's always within a reasonable freshness window. Coconut oil is worth keeping as a secondary storage item alongside your primary oil. Its higher saturated fat content makes it significantly more resistant to oxidation, giving it a shelf life of 2 to 3 years or more. It solidifies at room temperature, which actually helps preserve it against degradation. The cost per ounce is higher and the flavor is distinct, but as a backup fat source with extended stability, the last 2 items on this list are in a completely different category from everything we've covered so far. Not just harder to find. Not just more expensive. These are foods where the shelf life is measured not in years but in decades. And for one of them, in centuries. We're about to make a completely different kind of decision about food storage. This is not about the next disruption. This is about building something that will still be there and still be viable 30 years from now. Pay attention. Item 10. Hard wheat berries, the 25-year investment. Most people who think seriously about food storage, and that makes intuitive sense, flour is what you actually use to bake. Flour is already processed. It's ready. But flour has a shelf life problem that most people have never fully reckoned with. Standard all-purpose flour stored under good conditions lasts 1 to 2 years before quality degradation becomes meaningful. Whole wheat flour goes rancid faster because its oil content begins to oxidize relatively quickly after milling. After 18 months, you may technically have flour, but it will produce noticeably inferior results in baking. Hard wheat berries, the whole unprocessed grain, operate by completely different biological rules. Properly stored in sealed food-grade buckets with oxygen absorbers, hard wheat berries maintain viability for 25 to 30 years. That is not a manufacturing claim. That is not label language. That is food science based on the biology of the intact grain, the protective outer bran layer preventing oxidation, the absence of available oxygen inside a sealed bucket, and the low moisture environment that prevents microbial activity from ever gaining a foothold. Here's where the label deception we talked about at item 1 shows up again. And this time the gap is even larger. The printed date on a commercially packaged bag of wheat berries might show 5 to 8 years. That number is, again, a manufacturer's liability threshold, the point at which they'll stop standing behind the product legally. The actual food science number, under proper storage conditions, is 4 to 5 times longer. A bag that says it expires in 2030 may still be fully viable in 2050. That changes the entire financial and logistical calculation for long-term storage. You are not buying food that expires. You are making a one-time infrastructure investment. When you're ready to use wheat berries, you grind them into fresh flour using a hand grain mill. Yes, the mill is an additional expense. Quality manual grain mills run between $150 and $300. But the comparison is this: 50 pounds of flour that will degrade within 18 months versus 50 pounds of wheat berries that will be viable in 30 years. That is not a close calculation. Beyond baking, wheat berries can be cooked and eaten whole without any grinding at all. The texture is nutty and chewy, similar to farro or pearl barley. Cook them like rice, 2 cups water per 1 cup grain, roughly 45 minutes. Add bouillon to the water, and you have a genuinely hearty, satisfying grain dish from a bucket that's been sitting in your basement for a decade. No electricity. No mill. No special equipment. Just a pot and heat. Large format bags, 25 to 50 pounds, have been getting harder to source reliably over the past year. Online suppliers that previously had consistent stock have been experiencing gaps. Prices have been climbing. The time to accumulate this is before the next supply disruption, not during it, because during a disruption it's gone. I have one more item before I show you how everything on this list connects. And this last one, pay attention here, is the only food on the entire list whose shelf life is genuinely measured in centuries. Item 11. Honey, the eternal food. In 2015, archaeologists working on excavations of ancient Egyptian tombs, the honey was estimated to be over 3,000 years old. They tasted it. It was still good. That's not a story. That's chemistry. Honey's combination of properties: extremely low moisture content that denies bacteria the water they need to survive, acidic pH that creates a hostile environment for microbial growth, and the production of natural hydrogen peroxide that actively disrupts cellular processes in bacteria, environment that is fundamentally and durably hostile to spoilage of any kind. Bacteria cannot reproduce in properly sealed honey. Yeast cannot ferment it. Mold cannot grow in it. The result is a food with a genuinely indefinite shelf life. Not decades. Not 100 years. Indefinitely, which in food storage terms is almost impossible to overstate. Nearly every other item in your stockpile has a rotation requirement, an expiration horizon, a management burden. Honey requires none of that. Buy it. Seal it. Put it somewhere that won't freeze solid or reach extreme heat. Walk away. Come back in 30 years. It will be fine. But here's where most people who store honey for sweetness alone are leaving significant value on the table. Honey is not just a food. It is emergency medical infrastructure. Raw honey has documented, peer-reviewed, clinically studied efficacy as a wound treatment. The World Health Organization formally recognizes honey as a treatment option for infected wounds. Manuka honey specifically has been the subject of research evaluating its application against antibiotic-resistant bacteria. Beyond wound care, honey functions as a documented cough suppressant, a throat treatment during infection, and a direct fast energy source. A tablespoon delivers immediate, quickly absorbed glucose and fructose that bypasses digestive processing compared to complex carbohydrates. Think about what that means in a scenario where pharmacy access is disrupted, an extended regional emergency, a prolonged power outage, a period of genuine supply chain breakdown. 10 pounds of raw honey in your storage is not a pantry item in that context. It is a partial first aid kit with a shelf life of forever. Large format honey containers, multi-pound jugs, 5-pound tubs, the formats that represent genuine cost per ounce efficiency. Small jars remain widely available at every grocery store I've checked. The large containers that make economic sense for serious storage are becoming increasingly sporadic. The supply pressure comes from two directions. Colony collapse disorder continues to reduce domestic bee populations, and increased scrutiny of international honey imports for adulteration has tightened the supply of cheaper foreign product. When you see large format raw honey in stock, buy more than you think you need. This is one of the only genuinely indefinite shelf life foods available to you. The word indefinite is not casual here. It is literal. Before I give you the one piece of practical framework that ties everything together, let me show you something about how these 11 items actually function. These aren't 11 separate purchases. They are a system. And when you understand how they work together, the whole becomes significantly more powerful than any individual item. Here's what I call the flavor stack. Picture day 14 of living exclusively from your stored food. Not a dramatic emergency, just a prolonged disruption where you're eating from your reserves. Here's an actual meal built entirely from this list. You cook wheat berries in water with 2 bouillon cubes. That's your base, savory filling, complete. You stir in a tablespoon of cooking oil for fat and sustained energy. You open a small can of tomato paste and work a portion into the grain with some of your stored spices. You're building real flavor now. On the side, you open sardines packed in olive oil. The oil goes into the pan first, the sardines follow, and you have protein and omega-3s with genuine flavor. A spoonful of honey and hot water is your drink. You have a real meal. Fat, protein, complex carbohydrates, omega-3s, electrolytes, antioxidants, flavor. Built entirely from quiet, unglamorous items that were available for purchase this week at prices that are still reasonable. Now let me give you one last tool. Something I'm calling the Supply Chain Canary framework, because it's how I personally watch for disruption before it hits the news. 3 signals to watch for at your regular grocery store. First, when large format versions of any staple item disappear from the shelf while small format versions remain. Start paying attention. Second, when per unit price diverges sharply between size formats, meaning the cost per ounce in a large container goes higher than the small container, that signals a supplier reducing large format production while maintaining small format to protect retail relationships. Third, when SKU count in a category drops, meaning fewer brands or varieties are available. 1 or 2 of these signals is noise. All 3 at once on the same product is a supply chain canary. You don't need to track 8 stores like I do. You just need to notice these patterns in the store you already visit. Here's the total picture. All 11 items on this list can be acquired incrementally, in manageable quantities, for under $200 spread across 6 regular shopping trips. That's not a financial strain. That's 2 extra items per cart per visit for 6 weeks. At the end of it, you have a real usable, nutritionally complete food reserve built quietly, without drama, without reorganizing your life. The people who will be in the best position 6 months from now are the ones who acted when it still felt slightly optional. Not when the news ran the story. Not when the shelves were visibly bare. Now, if you found any of this useful, drop a 1 in the comments. Just a 1. That's all I'm asking. It tells me you're taking this seriously, and it helps this reach more people who need it before they need it. Subscribe and turn on notifications because in my next video, I'm going to show you the 5 items that experienced preppers quietly remove from their stockpiles after their first year, and what they replace them with. The answers are not what you'd expect, and understanding why they make that switch will save you from the single most common and expensive mistake in food storage. Stay calm. Stay consistent. Take care of your people.